Hey, what's up everybody? Ramey here, otherwise known as Dr. Ray. And today what I want to do is I want to kind of go through and start to talk about like where the idea of us learning from multiple channels, i.e. learning from the basically the multimedia principle, the use of visuals and oral or printed text is better for learning than just one. I want to go back in time and start to talk about like when did researchers come up with that idea. The reason I want to do that is I see a lot of people simply say when talking about like important things instructional designers should know, one of the first things they mention is you should know the multimedia principle. You should know the multimedia principle. And that's good. I love that suggestion. But in some ways, it kind of bypasses a significant body of research that really came up with the multimedia principle a lot sooner. Even when I search ChatGPT and I ask it, like, when did the first research studies on like the use of visuals, like I actually asked what was the first research on the use of multiple visual channels for learning done, and it talks about the 1990s and the multimedia principles. It does talk about a little bit about Pavio, and so it does go back a little bit that far and talk about dual coding, but it talks about Sweller's research in the 80s on cognitive load theory, but that's also ignoring a big bulk of research that really came up with these ideas. And I want to talk just a little bit about that, where that history and where that came from. Why do I think this is important? One, I don't think it's important to ignore history. I think we need to know it. I think we need to know where this stuff came from. I also kind of get the feeling that some instructional design, or that like there's this feeling that the multimedia principle is brand new too. And that itself wasn't until the late 90s. So we're talking 30 years ago. So like, I want to make sure we just always pay attention to the history. And if I can help us in even a little bit, help some people reflect back on it and start to explore this stuff a little more, I think that's cool. So I want to talk a little bit about like the history of how we got to that point of this multiple channels and the media and technologies that got us there. Because remember, we've had visuals forever. Visuals for learning and communication. We had cave paintings. Like the first humans had cave paintings. Why did we do that? It was a way for us to communicate. So we've known that visuals can be used to illustrate points forever, right? Humans started to recognize that the use of visuals or illustrations along with text can be beneficial. One of the first printed books in 1000 BC called the Bamberg Apocalypse, which is some kind of religious like book. I don't know too much about it other than it was it's kind of known as the first printed book with visuals and text. 1000 BC. So we kind of started to recognize humans, like in our brain, we know that this stuff all makes sense. So we started to actually utilize it. But there were very few, we don't have lots of books from back then, and we don't have lots of examples of books that also have illustrations. Some in the 1400s, 1600s. We hear like these scattered throughout history of when we're heavily books with pictures and text. But remember, like photography itself wasn't really created until like the mid 1800s. Like photography was invented in like 1830s. So we didn't have the ability to take pictures. We only had illustrations back then. One of the first scientific books for learning with visuals and text is actually written by Charles Darwin in 1872. So, it wasn't until that we had photography, we had illustrations. It wasn't until that late 1800s when TV was starting to be invented. So TV became photography, we had the mid 1800s, then we started to create TV around that time too. But it wasn't until the early 1900s, really like the 19-teens, 1920s, when television, we were able to broadcast one picture to another room, to another place, and we started to create TV. Once we created TV, that's when the big rush, when TV became a thing, that big rush in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, rush of learning and multimedia and learning through multiple channels became something that researchers started to explore. So that's when I pinpoint the research on multiple channels. So one of the first I guess the first studies that I'm able to personally find in the literature that recommends the use of multiple channels, really television, is in the 1930s and 1940s. We've got Wise, 1939, McCowan, 1940, Goodman, 1942, Dale's Code of Experience, 1946, Day and Beach, 1950, and the list goes on of studies that supported the use of multiple modes of multiple channels versus just one. Essentially, the idea of the multimedia principle was created in the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, expanded in, I want to say hundreds of research studies, but really this idea that people learn better from pictures and words than text alone was created almost 100 years ago, like 80, 90 years ago, which is absolutely insane. So when people start to talk about these ideas, we have to remember that these ideas we're not like light bulb goes off, we just thought of something new. We're regurgitating information that researchers knew almost 100 years ago. And we're not just talking about like the idea of multimedia principle 1, that we learn better from pictures and images than text alone. I want to go into a little bit more about that history, starting from like the 40s, 50s, 60s until today when we get to the multimedia principle and beyond. Back in the 50s and 40s, 50s, and 60s, we were looking at a lot of different variables, not just the basic multimedia principle. I'm going to pull up a picture here and just show you some of the different things that we were looking at. But we were looking at cueing, modes of instruction, content, like difficulty, like novice versus expert. We were looking at personality, educational background of people, personality of instructor, different types of objectives, different types of information, looking at different types of content. So like high versus low level content, broken out into multiple different ways. One of the first studies to look at because a lot of that early research looked at comprehension. It did not really go into problem solving and look at higher levels of instruction. One of those first studies was done by Dwyer in 1967, starting to really look at like high versus low level knowledge. We looked at student characteristics, like their motivation to learn. I mean, then we started there were tons and tons, and these drive me nuts, of comparison studies on different kinds of media. Like, does it matter when a student's looking at a television versus a newspaper, and images and printed text on newspaper or paper versus images and text on a television screen? So we started to look at that. And we're still before computers. I'll get there. Then we started to come up with all these different theories around learning. And this is where we started to come up with, like, Badley and Hitch came up with their model of working memory. This is where we start to come up with with dual coding. The idea, like, Pavio's dual coding theory, 1971, started to come up with this idea that we do probably have two channels. So we had tons of multi-channel support and research for 40 years before dual coding came up, before it was that word. Remember, that word became popular. That didn't mean we didn't know it. Pavio had even talked about it in the 60s. We have, I probably mispronounced it, Shah. I'll put the quote up on the screen. Talks about dual multiple channel, this is 1968, dual or multiple channel information processing. Dimensionality of information generally increases. Increasing that dimensionality, which is having these multiple channels, usually results in the increase of information processing. When all these theories like working memory started to come about, we started to get a better understanding of how these multiple channels form. That led to dual coding in the 70s. We talked about these dual codes, but in that time, we had multiple other theories come about that happened to not become popular, either because they randomly didn't become popular or because we disproved them. Some of those, and some of the famous ones, propositional theory by Anderson, Anderson, I believe it was ACT was what they used, and talking about how people store information. I really liked Anderson's theory more applied to computers, the way that computer logic runs rather than humans. But it was one of the main popular theories at the time as well, competing with Baddeley's working memory theory. Another one was multi-store memory by Atkinson and Shifron. You guys can go in, take a look. Like these names that I'm telling you, like these are famous names in the field of working memory and the backbone of multimedia research. So go in and start to look at like who these people are. Another one that you've all heard of, learning styles. Yeah, they came about during this time too. They were the early 80s, like 84 with Kolb, started to come about. The idea of maybe that's how we learn. Now, obviously, we do know that the reason learning styles was phased out of the literature is because we've been able to prove that basically there was no evidence ever for it. We know that it should not be a thing, but it still became popular, right? So like, that's why I start to question. I question everything. I hear like a theory and I want to say, what's the background? Where did we come up with this? What supports it? That's why when we look at when learning styles came about, you know, we never had information or good evidence to support them. Kolb tells us that as well. They just happen to become extremely popular. But when we look and just assume multimedia principles, right, we do actually have 70 years of before the multimedia principle became popular in the late 90s with the so basically in the late 90s, people like Mayer, John Sweller with cognitive load theory, which he had written about much earlier, Moreno and Meyer, late 70s, like 77 or 97, 99, lots of different papers around the idea of the cognitive theory of multimedia learning, which was built upon the 70 years of research that we've had, and kind of took all of it. And the reason it became popular was for several reasons. One, Mayer took all that research and combined it into one solidified theory, which was really an expansion on dual coding. But, you know, the idea that the idea of calling it the multimedia principle was really calling something that had been written about and we knew 70, 60, 70, 50, 60, 70 years prior and was established and something well known in the research. It just happened to become the popular thing. And from that was able to create the multimedia principles, which are a key piece of our field, a key piece of what instructional designers do, but only one. There's many other theories out there that I find ignored in the literature that I'm going to start to talk about that we should be focusing on, and we don't. We've like picked a few for some reason that we focus on. Like we tell people we learn. If I asked instructional designers what are like 5 theories, they would mention the multimedia principles, but they ignore like 100 others that are equally important in other ways. So that's something I like to talk about as well. But in this late 90s time, we came up with the cognitive theory. Mayer came up with the cognitive theory of multimedia learning. And from that, he has expanded that for a number of years. But, you know, sometimes we talk about the multimedia principle as if it's new, but the multimedia principle itself is 30 years old, the idea of it. And in fact, the ideas that formed it, the multimedia, is really almost 100 years old, which is amazing to me. And it's super cool to go back and look at that history of visual learning and like, who were those people that came up with that idea? You know, it's really neat and interesting to come up with that, to examine that history. I just wanted to create this video so that we start to think like, we know the multimedia principle itself is not new. It's 30 years old. And the idea of it is 100. And I think that history is important. And that's where like something like learning styles get dismissed, that learning styles is 40, 50 years old, the idea of it. But there is no backbone to it. It came about when we were coming up with all these terms around working memory and the idea of how people learn, but there are a bunch of theories like that that just never took off the way that like Baddeley's working memory model did. So it's important for us to go back and just look, and it's cool to just see some of this stuff. It's fun for me to do research on this stuff, pull up old books, pull up old journal articles from the 30s, 40s, 50s that we still even have, because some of them just to do this video, me searching through some research, like to find day and beach 1950, I couldn't find the article. I found some versions of it, but like they're lost. I found some PDFs of it that were broken, not working. Like, can we find it? Probably, but it's becoming more and more challenging, and I don't want to lose some of that stuff. So if I can ever talk about it, get you guys to look up any of these articles. You have anything to add, I'd love to hear more about from this video. This was just a very high level overview. I did not go into details of this stuff because there are classes that talk about this stuff forever and ever and could go into such detail and depth. But I want to start to explore that history. Thanks for watching, y'all.